September 1944. A biting Pacific wind pulls at the frayed uniforms of the men standing on the deck of the transport ship, but the air that greets them as they dock in San Francisco is different. It is heavy with the scent of diesel, salt, and something foreign, the smell of a civilization that had not yet begun to starve. For the Japanese soldiers peering through the railings, this was supposed to be the end. They had been raised on the rigid tenets of the Senjinkan, the code of military conduct, which stated clearly that one must never endure the shame of imprisonment. To be captured was to be dead to one's family, dead to the emperor, and a ghost in the eyes of the ancestors. They expected the Americans to be as brutal as the propaganda had promised, a subhuman, individualistic enemy that would surely execute them upon arrival or subject them to the same starvation and torture they had witnessed in the jungles of the occupied territories. Instead, they were met with an overwhelming, mechanical silence. The sheer scale of the American mainland was the first psychological blow. As the trains rattled inland toward the camps in the American heartland, the prisoners stared through the windows at miles of undisturbed farmland, golden wheat swaying in the breeze, and towns where the streetlights still burned with an arrogant defiance against the darkness. This was the historical context of their captivity, a transition from a world of total mobilization and scarcity to a land where the war felt like a distant rumor. The United States was producing aircraft and tanks at a rate that defied their comprehension, but it was also producing something even more terrifying: excess. As the prisoners were processed into the camps, the emotional contrast deepened. They stood in lines, thin and jaundiced from months of tropical diseases and meager rations, watching American GIs who looked like giants. These guards did not carry the hollow eyes of the men they had fought in Burma or Guadalcanal. They were well-fed, laughing, and seemingly bored by the gravity of the conflict. The prisoners expected a dungeon. They found a facility with running water, clean barracks, and 3 meals a day that contained more protein than a Japanese sergeant major would see in a month. In this environment, the psychological armor of the imperial soldier began to hairline fracture. The silence of the American plains was not the silence of a dying nation, but the quiet confidence of a giant that had not even broken a sweat. In the corner of the dusty exercise yard, a single object lay forgotten in the dirt. It was a baseball, its white leather scuffed but its red stitching still tight and precise. To the American guards, it was a toy, a common item of no consequence. To the Japanese prisoner who first spotted it, it was a symbol of a terrifying industrial perfection. In Japan, leather was being stripped from civilian shoes to support the war effort. Here, a ball made of high-quality hide was left to rot in the sun. It was the first time the prisoners realized that the enemy they were told was decadent was actually something far more dangerous. They were a people who could afford to play while the rest of the world burned. The white ball sat in the dust, a small, spherical testament to an abundance that the prisoners could not yet name, but could certainly feel. Inside the barracks of the American interior, a heavy, suffocating silence took hold. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of men who considered themselves already dead. For the Japanese soldier, the concept of the prisoner was a non-entity, a biological ghost who had failed his ultimate duty. They sat on their cots, their backs straight, staring at the floor, waiting for the blow that never came. In their minds, the historical weight of the Meiji-era military reforms and the fanatical devotion of the Showa period had created a singular path: victory or suicide. To find themselves in a clean room, being fed white bread and jam, was a psychological torture far more effective than any physical interrogation. It forced them to confront a terrifying possibility, that the ideology of total sacrifice was not a universal law, but a local one. The prisoners expected the Americans to operate under the same brutal logic of the co-prosperity sphere. They expected to be worked to death or used for bayonet practice, yet they were met with a confusing, almost offensive kindness. They watched the American guards through the wire, noticing how they spoke to one another without the sharp slaps or public humiliations common in the Imperial Japanese Army. There was no rigid hierarchy that demanded the constant degradation of the inferior. Instead, there was a casual efficiency that felt alien. The historical evidence of their shock was recorded in the diaries of men like Lieutenant Takahashi, who noted with a mix of disgust and envy that the American soldiers treated the war as a difficult job rather than a sacred religious crusade. This internal struggle created a profound emotional contrast. While the Japanese prisoners were trapped in a cycle of shame, the Americans seemed entirely liberated from it. The symbolic white baseball appeared again, this time in the hands of a young guard from Ohio who sat on a fence post, absent-mindedly tossing it into the air and catching it. To the guard, it was a rhythmic distraction. To the prisoners watching from the shadows, the ball was a miracle of geometry. It was perfectly round, perfectly stitched, and seemingly limitless in supply. In Japan, every scrap of leather was being tanned for combat boots or pilot jackets. Here, a soldier used a high-quality leather sphere simply to pass the time while he whistled a popular tune. The transformation of their ideology began in these small, quiet observations. They started to realize that the softness of the American character, which their commanders had promised would lead to a Japanese victory, was actually a symptom of immense strength. A nation that could afford to be casual during a world war was a nation that had already won the logistical battle. They watched the guard catch the ball over and over, a simple, repetitive action that represented a level of industrial security they could no longer imagine. The sound of the ball hitting the leather glove was a soft, thudding heartbeat of a society that had mastered the Earth's resources. The prisoners, once convinced of their spiritual superiority, began to look at their own calloused hands and wonder if they had been betrayed by the very scarcity they had been taught to worship. By October 1944, the sensory overload of the American interior had settled into a rhythmic, haunting realization of industrial disparity. The prisoners were marched to the mess halls 3 times a day, where they encountered the most potent evidence of American power, the food. In the military culture of Imperial Japan, rations had become a grim mathematical equation of survival, handfuls of rice mixed with barley, often stretched with sawdust or insects. Here, the Japanese men were confronted with mountains of white bread, fresh milk, and meat that appeared on their trays with a regularity that seemed almost blasphemous. They ate in a stunned, reflective silence, watching the American cooks scrape leftovers into large bins. This waste was a concept that did not exist in the Japanese vocabulary of war. It was the ultimate display of a nation that possessed so much it had forgotten the meaning of hunger. This abundance was the engine of a democratic ideology that the prisoners had been taught was a weakness. Their commanders had insisted that the American mongrel culture, obsessed with comfort and luxury, would crumble before the spiritual purity of the Japanese warrior. Yet, as they worked on labor details outside the camp perimeters, they saw the opposite. They saw endless convoys of trucks, new tires gleaming with rubber that Japan had sacrificed thousands of lives to secure in the Dutch East Indies. They saw high-tension power lines stretching across the horizon, carrying enough electricity to light entire cities while their own families back in Tokyo were living in the mandatory shadows of total blackout. The historical reality was becoming undeniable. Japan was fighting a war of spirit against a nation that had industrialized the very sun. The symbolic white baseball remained the focal point of this cultural collision. During a break in a field clearing detail, a group of prisoners watched as a supply crate was opened near the guard shack. It was not filled with ammunition or medical supplies, but with brand-new sporting equipment. Bats made of polished northern ash, leather gloves that smelled of oil and rich earth, and dozens of pristine white baseballs. One prisoner, a former university student from Kyoto, stood transfixed by the sight. In his homeland, the government had banned baseball as an enemy sport, melting down the trophies and prohibiting the use of English terms like strike and out. Here, the enemy was shipping crates of these items to the front lines of their own prison camps. The contrast was visceral. The Japanese soldier was expected to be a weapon. his only purpose to be spent in the fire of combat. The American soldier, however, was permitted, even encouraged, to remain a person. The recurring sight and sound of the baseball became a psychological anchor for the prisoners. Each time a ball was hit, the sharp, resonant crack of wood against horsehide echoed across the plains like a rifle shot, but it was a sound of life, not death. It represented a civilization that could produce both the B-29 superfortress and the perfect recreational sphere with equal ease. To the men in the wire, the ball was no longer just a toy. It was a physical manifestation of a freedom that allowed a man to play in the midst of a global cataclysm, a luxury that their own rigid, starved empire could never permit. As the autumn of 1944 deepened, the prisoners observed the inner workings of the camp with the precision of men who had once been trained to spot weaknesses in an enemy's armor. What they found instead were the walls of luxury that defined American captivity. In the barracks of the guards, the Japanese soldiers caught glimpses of a life that felt like a fevered dream of prosperity. They saw men reading glossy magazines printed on high-quality paper, listening to music from polished mahogany radio cabinets, and writing letters home with fountain pens that never seemed to run dry. There was a profound historical significance to these mundane observations. It was the visual evidence of a home front that had not been touched by the physical destruction of war, a sanctuary of industry that could equip its soldiers with both the weapons of destruction and the comforts of peace. The emotional contrast was staggering. The Japanese prisoners had come from a military culture where even a single cigarette was a precious commodity, shared among a dozen men. Here, they watched the American GIs smoke entire packs of Lucky Strikes, discarding the butts with a casualness that suggested an infinite supply. They saw the guards' laundry, sturdy cotton shirts and woolen socks, hanging on lines, clean and bright. In the Pacific, the imperial soldier's uniform was often a rotting rag, held together by sweat and desperation. In the American heartland, even the lowest-ranking private lived with a material dignity that surpassed the highest officers of the Japanese army. This realization began to erode the prisoners' sense of spiritual superiority. They had been told that American materialism would make them weak, but they were seeing that this same materialism provided them with a terrifying, inexhaustible endurance. At the center of this observation remained the white baseball. It was often perched on the edge of a guard's desk or tucked into the back pocket of a pair of dungarees. To the prisoners, this recurring object became a silent witness to American indifference toward scarcity. One afternoon, a prisoner assigned to cleaning duty noticed a stack of brand-new leather gloves in the corner of a supply room. They were thick, supple, and smelled of neatsfoot oil, a luxury of preservation that was unthinkable in a Japan currently scavenging for every drop of lubricant for its failing aircraft. The ball and the glove were not just equipment. They were artifacts of a civilization that prioritized the human right to leisure. This abundance was not a sign of softness, as the propaganda had claimed, but a symptom of a logistical titan. The prisoners began to understand that the Americans were not fighting this war because they were hungry for resources, but because they were protecting a way of life that allowed for such waste. The symbolic weight of the baseball grew as the men realized that for every ball they saw in the camp, there were millions more being manufactured in factories that the Imperial Air Force could never reach. The constant rhythmic thwack of a ball being thrown into a glove became a psychological drumbeat, reminding the prisoners that they were not just captured by men, but by an economic engine that had already decided the outcome of the war. They were living inside the belly of a giant that could afford to be kind because it was too powerful to be afraid. By the arrival of November 1944, a new directive from the camp administration transformed the daily routine of the prisoners. They were assigned to a labor detail on the edge of the compound, a flat expanse of sun-baked earth that had previously served as nothing more than a buffer zone. Armed with shovels and rakes, the Japanese men were ordered to level the ground and remove every stray stone. Initially, they believed they were constructing a new foundation for barracks or perhaps a high-security execution ground. The historical irony was profound. These men, who had been trained to dig fortifications and spider holes for a desperate defense of the Pacific Islands, were now using those same skills to prepare a field of dreams. As the days passed, the true purpose of the work became clear. They were not building a fortification, but a baseball diamond. Under the watchful eyes of guards who occasionally leaned on their rifles to offer technical advice on the slope of the pitcher's mound, the prisoners witnessed the birth of a playground. The emotional contrast was sharp. To the Japanese military mind, labor was a tool of survival or a punishment of the conquered. To see it used for the creation of a recreational space in the middle of a global war felt like a hallucination. They watched as backstops were erected and white chalk was used to delineate the foul lines. Perfect, straight boundaries that imposed a sense of order and play upon the chaotic backdrop of their captivity. The symbolism of the white baseball intensified during this period. As the diamond took shape, the guards began to bring more equipment to the field. One afternoon, a prisoner who had been a surveyor in civilian life watched as a crate of balls was delivered. He noted the sheer extravagance of the packaging, each ball individually wrapped in tissue paper, nestled in cardboard boxes that were themselves masterpieces of industrial printing. In Japan, even the paper for a child's school book was reclaimed and reused until it fell apart. Here, the Americans used high-grade paper to protect a leather sphere that was destined to be hit with a stick and lost in the tall grass. This labor detail became a silent classroom for the prisoners. They began to understand that for Americans, the boundary between war and life was not as rigid as it was in the Empire. The guards could be vigilant and disciplined one moment, then transition into a debate about batting averages the next. This fluidity was a mark of a democratic spirit that the Japanese found both baffling and intimidating. They realized that the Field of Dreams was not just a place for a game. It was a physical manifestation of a culture that refused to let the war consume its soul. The diamond, with its pristine white lines and its recurring promise of the white baseball, stood as a testament to a civilization that could build a sanctuary of leisure anywhere in the world, simply because it had the resources and the will to do so. In the crisp air of mid-November, the first actual practice sessions began on the newly leveled field. The prisoners were permitted to sit on the sun-bleached bleachers, watching as the American guards shed their heavy jackets and stepped onto the dirt. The historical records of such camps frequently noted the intense, almost clinical focus with which the Japanese men observed these games. To them, this was not mere recreation, it was an intelligence-gathering mission. They watched the mechanics of the American swing, the coordinated movement of the outfielders, and the democratic nature of the sport itself. In the Imperial Japanese Army, an officer's word was absolute and his person was sacred, yet on this field, the prisoners saw a lieutenant strike out and endure the good-natured ribbing of a private. This fluidity of rank, this casual equality in the pursuit of a game, was a profound ideological shock. The emotional contrast between the observers and the players was visible in every inning. The Japanese men remained motionless, their faces masks of disciplined neutrality, while the Americans were a riot of kinetic energy and noise. The guards shouted, spat, and argued over close calls with a fervor that seemed disproportionate to the stakes of the match. For the prisoners, who had been taught that victory was the only metric of a man's worth, the American ability to invest so much passion into a useless activity was baffling. Yet, beneath that confusion was a growing respect for the physical prowess of their captors. These were not the weak, soft-bodied men described in the pamphlets dropped over the Pacific. These were athletes, fueled by a caloric intake that provided them with an explosive vitality. The recurring symbol of the white baseball took on a more dynamic quality during these sessions. It was no longer a static object in the dust. It was a projectile, cutting through the air with a velocity that demanded attention. The crack of the bat, a sharp, resonant sound that echoed off the barracks, became the heartbeat of the camp. Each time the ball soared into the blue American sky, it represented a triumph over the gravity of war. The prisoners watched the ball's trajectory, realizing that the precision of its manufacture allowed for a predictable, mastered flight. In a world where their own supplies were failing and their weapons were often prone to jamming, the reliability of this simple sporting object was a haunting reminder of American quality control. The transformation of their perception deepened as they analyzed the game's logic. They saw that baseball required individual excellence but relied entirely on collective coordination. It was a mirror of the American war effort itself, a million individual parts moving in a loose but effective harmony. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the white ball seemed to glow, catching the last embers of the day. The prisoners, once convinced that the West was a fragmented and dying culture, began to see a terrifying cohesion in the way these men played. They were witnessing a society that did not need to be forced into unity by a central authority, but rather one that found it naturally through the shared rules of a common game. The diamond was no longer just dirt and chalk, it was a laboratory of democracy, and the white baseball was its most eloquent messenger. As the winter of 1944 approached, a transformation occurred that would permanently alter the psyche of every man within the camp's wire. It began on a Tuesday evening, just as the purple bruised light of the American plains was fading into a deep, absolute black. The prisoners had expected the end of the day to bring the usual darkness of a nation at war, the mandatory blackouts they had known in Tokyo and Osaka, where even a stray ember from a cigarette could bring a reprimand. Instead, they witnessed a miracle of infrastructure. With a series of heavy metallic thuds that vibrated through the ground, for massive steel towers positioned around the diamond surged to life. High-intensity electric floodlights erupted with a blinding, predatory brilliance, instantly incinerating the shadows and turning the dirt field into a stage of artificial day. The historical significance of this moment cannot be overstated. While the cities of Europe and Asia were huddled in fear, starving for coal and oil, the American interior was so flush with energy that it could afford to illuminate a playground. The prisoners stood at their barracks windows, shielding their eyes from the glare. To men who had spent years in the lightless jungles of the South Pacific, this was not just technology. It was a supernatural display of power. It was the visual evidence of a civilization that had mastered the electron as thoroughly as it had mastered the assembly line. The lights hummed with a low, constant vibration, a sound of industrial stability that suggested the Americans were not merely winning the war. They were barely aware that a shortage of resources was even possible. The emotional contrast was visceral. The Japanese soldiers felt a sudden, crushing sense of smallness. They realized that their struggle, their spiritual endurance, was being met by a foe that could literally turn off the night. The symbolic white baseball appeared under these lights, and it looked different than it had in the sun. It was now a glowing, ethereal orb, reflecting the thousands of watts of power pouring down from the towers. When a player threw it, the ball left a shimmering trail in the vision of the onlookers, a streak of pure white against the velvet black of the surrounding prairie. This was the pinnacle of American waste, the use of massive amounts of precious electricity to facilitate a game of catch. This spectacle forced a final, agonizing transformation in the prisoners' ideology. They had been told that the Americans were a soft, decadent people who would lose their will in the dark. Yet here, the Americans had created their own light. The crack of the bat under the floodlights sounded sharper, more definitive, echoing across the silent fields of the Midwest like a declaration of permanence. The prisoners watched as the white baseball soared into the dark sky, only to be caught by a man standing in a pool of artificial radiance. It was a terrifying realization. They were not fighting a nation of men. They were fighting a nation that had successfully industrialized the sun, and the white baseball was the tiny, perfect moon around which their new, brightly lit world now revolved. The great game commenced under the violent brilliance of the electric towers, a spectacle that redefined the prisoners' understanding of the possible. As the first pitch was thrown, the Japanese men sat in the bleachers, their shadows elongated and sharp against the illuminated dust. The scene was an sensory paradox. The air was cold with the coming winter, yet the field was a sanctuary of warmth and artificial day. The historical reality was a testament to American logistical supremacy. While the Japanese logistics chain had collapsed into horse-drawn carts and starvation, the Americans had transported thousands of tons of steel and electrical equipment into the middle of the prairie solely to facilitate a contest of skill. This was the great game, not merely because of the sport, but because it served as a live demonstration of a civilization that could manufacture its own environment. The emotional contrast reached a fever pitch as the innings progressed. To the Japanese onlookers, the game was a display of casual brilliance. They watched as a private from Brooklyn tracked a fly ball into the darkness above the lights, waiting for it to reappear like a falling star. The confidence required to trust that the ball would return to the light, to know that the system would not fail, was a form of faith the prisoners had lost. In their world, everything was failing. The planes, the ships, the very soil of the home islands. Here, the Americans operated with a terrifying certainty. They played with a fierce, individualistic joy that the Japanese had been taught was the hallmark of a weak and fractured society. Yet, the coordination of the double play and the silent communication between the pitcher and catcher revealed a collective strength that was more flexible, and therefore more resilient, than the rigid obedience of the Imperial Army. The recurring symbol of the white baseball was the absolute protagonist of this night. Under the floodlights, the ball did not just reflect light, it seemed to emit it. It was a perfect, spinning center of gravity around which the entire camp orbited. Every time the bat connected, the sound was amplified by the surrounding silence of the Midwestern night, a sharp percussive clack that signaled another successful execution of American engineering. The ball moved with a predatory grace, cutting through the thick, electrified air. For the men in the wire, the ball became a metaphor for the American war machine. It was standardized, high quality, and seemingly inexhaustible. If one ball was lost to the darkness beyond the fence, another was immediately produced from a pocket, just as white and just as perfect as the last. This night game functioned as a final shattering of the prisoners' indoctrination. They were observing the decadent West at its most extravagant, and they found it to be invincible. The realization was not one of fear, but of a profound, hollowed-out understanding. They saw that the American soldier was not a reluctant conscript forced into battle, but a man who brought his entire culture, his hobbies, and his luxuries to the front lines. The white ball, flying through the artificial day of the floodlights, was a message from a future that Japan could not reach. It was a world where a man could be a warrior during the day and a ballplayer at night, a world where abundance was so common that it could be used as a backdrop for a game. The prisoners watched, their eyes wide and reflecting the glare, as the Americans ran the bases with a casual, terrifying speed. As the game concluded and the electric towers hummed toward silence, a profound ideological collapse occurred within the barracks. The Japanese prisoners, men who had been forged in the fire of a cult of austerity, found their worldview fundamentally shattered. For years, they had been told that the Western democracies were fractured, selfish, and incapable of the spiritual harmony required for a long war. They were told that the Americans were a race of shopkeepers and luxury seekers who would crumble when the lights went out. Yet, the historical reality they witnessed in the American heartland was the opposite. The Americans did not just survive in the dark, they abolished it. They did not just endure the war, they thrived within it, maintaining a society so robust that it could export its pastimes and its comforts to the very edges of its prison camps. This transformation was not merely about the loss of a war, but the loss of a myth. The emotional contrast between their indoctrination and their experience was now absolute. They realized that the decadence they had been taught to despise was actually a manifestation of an incredible, terrifying efficiency. The American ability to produce millions of white baseballs, miles of copper wiring, and endless tons of high-grade steel was not a sign of a distracted nation, but but of a nation so powerful that it could fight a two-ocean war without ever having to sacrifice its soul or its leisure. The prisoners began to understand that the democratic spirit, the very thing they were told was a weakness, was the engine that allowed for this flexibility. It allowed a soldier to be a person, and in doing so, it gave him a reason to fight that was more sustainable than the grain obligation of the suicide charge. The symbolic white baseball, now resting in the equipment bin or tucked away in a guard's locker, remained the silent architect of this change. It had served as a bridge between two irreconcilable worlds. To the Japanese, it had become a physical proof of a civilization that possessed an infinite margin for error. In the imperial army, a single mistake, a single lost piece of equipment, or a single moment of individual thought was a crime against the state. In the American camp, they saw a world where mistakes were part of the game, where a strike was simply an invitation to try again, and where the loss of a ball was of no consequence because the factory doors were always open. This casual relationship with perfection was the ultimate psychological defeat for the captives. They sat in the returning darkness of the barracks, but the image of the illuminated field remained burned into their retinas. They were no longer the same men who had stepped off the transport ships in San Francisco. They were men who had seen the sun turned on by a switch, who had seen an enemy that played with the same intensity with which it fought. The ideology of the Holy War could not survive the sight of a night game under the floodlights. It was a realization that the future did not belong to those who sought a glorious death, but to those who built a world where life, and the simple rhythmic beauty of a white ball cutting through the air, was the highest priority. The silence of the camp was now the silence of men who were finally beginning to see the true face of the world they had tried to conquer. By the winter of 1945, the floodlights over the American Midwest were eventually dimmed, but the illumination they provided had already achieved its historical purpose. The Japanese prisoners, who would eventually be repatriated to a burned and broken homeland, carried with them an internal light that no military defeat could extinguish. They returned to a Japan that was forced to rebuild from the ashes of a failed ideology, but they do so with the knowledge that the world they were joining was not defined by the scarcity and sacrifice they had once worshipped. They had seen the alternative. They had witnessed a civilization that did not view leisure as a sin or abundance as a distraction, but rather as the very evidence of a functioning and free society. The epilogue of this encounter is written in the post-war landscape of Japan itself. The game of baseball, once banned as an enemy sport, became the national pastime of the reconstructed nation. This was not a cultural imposition by an occupying force, but a genuine adoption by men who had seen the game's democratic heart in the most unlikely of places, behind the barbed wire of a prisoner of war camp. The historical truth remains that the great game, played under those electric towers, was the first bridge between two warring civilizations. It demonstrated that while weapons can conquer territory, it is the casual, confident display of a superior way of life that conquers the mind. The Americans had won the war with their factories and their fleets, but they won the peace with their playgrounds. The recurring symbol of the glistening white baseball serves as the final poetic link to this larger truth. A simple sphere of leather and string became the vessel for a revolutionary idea, that a nation's greatest strength lies in its ability to provide for the happiness and play of its people, even in the midst of a global cataclysm. The sound of the crack of the bat, once a source of confusion for the captives, became the soundtrack of a new, democratic Japan. It was a sound that signaled the end of the era of the sword and the beginning of the era of the field. The white ball, once lost in the darkness of the Midwestern night, had landed in the hands of a generation that would never again be asked to die for a lack of resources. In the final reflection, the experience of the Japanese POWs stands as a testament to the irresistible gravity of abundance and freedom. They had entered the camp as ghosts of a dying empire and left as witnesses to a living one. They learned that the true power of America was not found in the barrel of a rifle or the bay of a bomber, but in the flick of a switch that could turn night into day for the sake of a game. The white baseball, resting on the green grass of 1,000 diamonds across the Pacific, remains a quiet monument to that realization, a reminder that in the contest between the culture of death and the culture of life, the one that knows how to play will always have the final inning.